2024 is finally over, and so it's time for the video I'm sure all of you were waiting for. The best and worst games of 2024. I'm here to grace you all with my objectively correct opinions. Now, there's a very good chance 2024 is the worst year in gaming history. At the very least, it's in the top 3, and if we're just counting AAA games, I would argue it's the worst year without a doubt. There's a reason why over 10,000 employees were laid off over the course of this year in the gaming industry, because there were so many bombs, because the games were just that bad. Even if you ignore the political propaganda factor, the amount of sheer mediocrity to just straight up bad games that came out this year was truly impressive. And so this was probably the most difficult year yet to find the 5 best games for me because, well, honestly, I didn't want to write down a list of the same 5 games you've likely already played this year. I like to treat my top 5 best as a list of recommendations. As for top 5 worst, it was almost as equally difficult, if only because there was so much to choose from. I probably played more mediocre to bad games this year than any other year I've ever played video games in my life. And you could say, yes, I do purposely seek those things out because it's more or less my job to find the worst video games have to offer. I think that's why a lot of you guys watch this channel. That and, of course, the political commentary. So in a way, I'm not even sure I'm really happy with the 5 worst I chose, just because I feel like there were about 10 games this year that all deserve to be equally shat on. Now, the rules for this list are simple, same as every other year. The most important rule is I have to have played the game. Oh, and spoiler for the rest of the video, but no, I never played Concord when it was out, so it's not on here, and neither is Dragon Age Veilguard for the same reason. And of course, the game has to have actually released this year. No early access games are allowed, no remasters, no graphical remakes. I have allowed one reimagining on this list because it was so offensive to me personally. And that's pretty much it for the rules. I think it's important to note that my rankings for the 5 worst and 5 best are not based on the objectively best and worst games, but on how much I personally enjoyed or hated the game. And yeah, I think that just about covers it. So without further ado, here are the best and worst games of 2024. We are now living through the age of remakes, or more accurately, demakes. The corpses of all of your favorite games you grew up with are now being paraded around on twisted puppet strings. And we're supposed to look at this and just say nothing. We're supposed to be happy that more people can get to experience the great games we grew up with. Why would I be happy that my favorite game has been butchered by people who never touched the original and missed the fucking point? Why should I be happy that people who didn't even care enough to set up an emulator and download a ROM now will blindly blow $70 on a game they won't even finish since they didn't care enough to try it in the last 20 years and are further contributing to the death of the video game industry? I'm supposed to be happy about that, apparently. Yeah, I'm not sure I really even have to explain why this earned a spot on this list. If you saw my video about remakes and Silent Hill 2 specifically, conceptually, this is quite possibly the worst video game remake that has ever existed, because Silent Hill 2 did not need a remake. Anyone who can't handle tank controls does not deserve to enjoy Silent Hill 2. Just stick to your dog shit video essays and pretend to be a fan of a game that you've never played and will never play, because I sure as hell do not count the remake as playing the original. Now, unlike a lot of other botched remakes over the years, a lot of the problems with Silent Hill 2 remake were pretty subtle, even to the point of people who supposedly played the original game not noticing any real differences. Now, those people were never fans, do not be fooled. Just because you played a game one time 20 years ago and remember kind of liking it does not mean you're a fan, especially if you're defending all of the numerous ways that this game butchered things from the original. Whether it's the censorship, the vastly inferior direction, the complete loss of subtlety in several scenes and environments, worse voice acting, horrifically ugly character designs, especially Angela, the significantly worse writing, especially in the ending with Mary's letter. The list goes on. The side-by-side comparison of the scene where you discover Maria at the end of Toluca Prison is still the most blatant example that the devs of Bloober Team did not understand the original game. And even the one saving grace of this remake was supposed to be the improved gameplay over the original. But at the end of the day, it just plays like a clone of The Last of Us, but with no enemy variety. You'll basically just kill the same 3 enemy types for 80% of the game, and there's like 3 times as many enemies as were in the original Silent Hill 2, so it gets very repetitive very quickly. This is truly a remake that is inferior to the original in every possible way except arguably graphics, and even then, the aesthetic design looks a lot more generic if you ask me. But yeah, this remake just felt like it was made for the average mindless consumer who would just eat up the slop and pretend they're a fan just to use it as a glorified conversation piece. I'm sure everyone's already forgotten they even played the fucking game by now. You shouldn't fucking remake the Mona Lisa. You shouldn't rewrite Lord of the Rings. You shouldn't refilm Citizen Kane. But it's okay to remake Silent Hill 2. Again, fuck the people who like this remake. Stop right there. This is the esteemed mercenary company headquarters of the Rotten Onions. These fucking stupid names, too. What kind of name is to Rotten Onions? Am I right, Redditor? Isn't that crazy? You wrote it. Look at this. This is how Redditors speak. My immersion is broken. My immersion is gone. This is like your D&D game. Like you joking with your buddies in a D&D game. You wrote it into your video game. Have self-awareness. As for number 4, we have Dread Delusion. Quite possibly the worst indie game I have ever played. Now, I know that might seem crazy given that there's so many like shitty asset flip simulator games, but I never go out of my way to actually play any of those. I try to only play good indie games, which is in complete contrast to AAA games where I'm basically purposely seeking out shit to cover on the channel. But Dread Delusion was a game that actually seemed pretty promising. It was sold to me as a spiritual successor to Morrowind. No, in reality, this is a glorified walking simulator full of left-wing politics masquerading as being morally gray, when in reality, there's an obvious correct choice and an obvious wrong choice to almost every moral dilemma. Not to mention, this has got to be some of the worst combat I've ever experienced in a video game, and I know if you're comparing it to something like Morrowind, which has been famously mocked a bunch of times, you can basically just see any 5-second gameplay clip, and yeah, that looks pretty fucking bad. But in a way, this is almost worse because it's basically nothing. There is no difficulty whatsoever. You just hit a guy like 3 times with a sword, he can't even really hit you back, and then you move on to the next enemy. It feels a lot more like a walking sim than a real video game. And to make matters worse, and this is something I actually forgot to cover in my Sincerity is Dead video, which was a thinly veiled excuse to review this game, I forgot to mention that this is actually nothing like any of Bethesda's games because you can't kill any of the NPCs. And so you have to listen to all these special snowflakes. Yes, every single character is like some diverse, shitty D&D self-insert. None of them are likable, and none of them really have enough dialogue either for you to get to know them. And you have no choice but to recruit them for the main quest anyway. So, although this game does have a little bit of player choice in the sense that almost every quest line ends in you having to make some binary choice that supposedly has consequences, but you never see any consequences for your actions. It basically just gets one line of dialogue during the ending slides. And I know some of you might say, oh, well, Fallout New Vegas is sort of the same thing. First of all, that's actually not true, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. But the difference is, nothing in this game feels earned. Essentially, the entire gameplay loop is walking from point A to point B, talking to an NPC, then walking somewhere else, going through some dungeon where you could realistically just run past every enemy because the AI is that brain dead and helpless, and then interacting with another object or NPC until the quest is over. And ultimately, this is like an r/atheism game where all of the gods are evil, but the evil fascist government is also evil. And so when you finally get to the ending, you chase this girl boss pirate captain who's built up as the greatest thing ever, of course. Not gonna get into that, but there's a shit ton of girl boss female characters in this game, and there's even like a quest about a character transitioning in a fucking medieval fantasy world. Again, just watch the video if you want details. You learn that the massive moral dilemma at the end of this is that the pirate captain chick has realized this world is full of suffering, and the only way to win is to completely remake the world over with some outer god creator being. And so you either choose if you want to not use its power because it might risk destroying everything, and also the whole game has kind of been teaching you gods are bad anyway, even if killing the gods also kills the land. That's the gray moral dilemma part. Or you can use this creator god's power to remake the world and make everything happy and wonderful. Does that sound like a morally gray choice to you? Even after I made that video, I went back and I did the good ending. And yes, there's no consequences. You literally just save the world. It is the objectively correct decision. This game was written by absolute fucking morons with indescribably huge egos who think if they were God, they could fix the world's problems. That is exactly what the hell this ending means. It is so ridiculous on so many levels. It's so childish, but it definitely perfectly reflects the leftist mind, does it not? A bunch of midwits with Dunning-Kruger who think they're better than fucking Elon Musk or Trump or even people we all hate like Jeff Bezos or Klaus Schwab or whatever. Yeah, the Redditor would be the much better world dictator. No, everyone would be happy. There'd be no more racism or sexism or homophobia if they remade the world. What a fucking joke. But Dread Delusion is just fucking garbage. It's basically if a bunch of Redditors came together and wrote a D&D setting. It's full of misery and suffering and also strong, diverse female characters who save the day and are cool. So it really just fucking takes you out of the experience because it's not grimdark, it's not edgy. No, it's safe edgy, there's no racism, there's no killing NPCs, it's awful. The armor does nothing. The armor does nothing!
I don't know.
What? Did I just drive right through him? No way. You can't hit enemies with bikes. No way. No. I want to be coming, but I'm not coming, so this is a problem. That's a double grenade? What? The AI just bugged out. They released this. This is a complete game that costs full price. They literally got off the bike and stood there. Oh boy, you knew a Ubisoft game had to be on the list, and Star Wars Outlaws is absolute trash, man. I don't even know where to begin with this one. I feel like everyone already dumpstered this game, but long story short, it's a Star Wars game where you don't play as a Jedi or Sith or really anyone with any interesting abilities. No, you play as a discount Han Solo, who is a mystery meat Goblina woman who's completely unlikable, and the player character's abilities are basically the same as every other Ubisoft game. It's a third-person shooter with really shitty stealth, and I feel like if I continue to describe the gameplay loop, it'll just sound like every single other Ubisoft game you've ever played. This could easily have been just Watch Dogs Star Wars Edition, but even buggier and even more boring somehow. The fact that you can't even do such basic shit as hijack enemy vehicles or even shoot on your own vehicle unless you're using your special ability is fucking crazy. This game is so boring, it's unreal, man. And of course, it's also full of girl bosses and that type of shit. Stormtroopers are hilariously incompetent as usual, which would be fine, except this is to such a insane degree that this 100-pound woman can punch out grown-ass men in armor. The armor does literally fucking nothing if you can just punch someone in the head, or even worse, slam their head on the ground when they're standing up, dude. How is this real? Oh, and of course, the villain is a white man, and I'm not talking about the Empire. No, it's a different white guy who decided to betray all the other crime families because he's white. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. In a weird way, I almost wish this game was worse, because every single time I talk about a Ubisoft game, I just say the same shit every time. Boring sandbox, boring activities. But this time, I actually skipped almost everything while playing this game, because I just had enough of sloppy sandbox games, and yet still, it was incredibly painful and more than deserves its spot on this list.
You always gotta end on your best joke.
That's the writers going, fuck you, gamers, fuck you. Who do you think you are? Our vision's better, our game's better than the games you liked.
Yeah, can you believe Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is only second place on this list? When I played this near the beginning of this year, I thought there's no way in hell a worse game comes out than this, but, well, when you see number one, it'll make sense. But yeah, what do I even need to say? This is one of the worst ideas for a video game in history. This is a glorified humiliation ritual. This was one of Kevin Conroy's last performances, and was canonically the Arkham Batman, and fucking Harley Quinn kills him! Do I even have to describe anything else about this game? And yet I feel like there are so many other things to talk about, man. It's actually underplayed how embarrassing it is that Superman gets killed by bullets. Fucking Superman. I don't care that they're kryptonite bullets, man. The Flash gets killed by bullets. The fucking Flash. Oh, and of course, Wonder Woman avoids the brainwashing because she's a woman, and she's even a diverse female in this one because she sure as hell doesn't look ethnically Greek. I'm sure the more ignorant amongst you would just say, oh, she's supposed to look similar to Gal Gadot. While I would say making the one Justice League member who's a quote-unquote good guy Israeli is certainly no coincidence. And there's all sorts of weird other political propaganda-esque shit in this game. There's a fucking trans flag in a game featuring the Suicide Squad. That joke practically writes itself. The fact that Jon Stewart Green Lantern is treated as one of the bad ones because he's a cop, while he's making fun of a blatant criminal black man, aka Deadshot, who isn't even supposed to be black, and yes, they make that joke at the beginning of the game. There's all sorts of weird shit in this game like that, where it's like, yeah, I guess it's not racist when they do it. And in one of the most out-of-character moments ever, Lex Luthor, of all people, basically says that Wonder Woman and the Amazonians are basically Ubermensch and have the perfect society. And look, man, I can only say the word propaganda so many times in a video before it becomes parody tier, but is this really anything other than that? And I haven't even talked about the gameplay yet because there's almost nothing to talk about. It's just pure slop. It plays like Crackdown, but really boring and shitty, and it's focused around co-op in a game where nobody's buying this shit and nobody did buy this shit, so it's not like you're going to be playing it with friends anyway. And of course, to add insult to injury, by contract, they had to support this game for a year despite it having virtually no players after the first week. And the DLC characters are a fucking joke in and of themselves. We have the insecure, like, incel Joker, which I'm sure this character is totally not supposed to be a mockery of Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, just like the movie sequel is totally not just shitting directly in the fans' mouths for daring to like the Joker. We have a female Mr. Freeze, and goddamn, this is one of the ugliest character designs I've ever seen. We get Deadshot's daughter is a character out of this massive DC universe that has all these cool villains you could have chosen for the Suicide Squad. This is truly the best they could do. So yeah, this is just a classic case of spitting in the fans' faces, and of course they reaped what they sowed. This was one of the biggest gaming bombs of the year. Fun fact, it's also the worst game my brother has ever played in his life, and I only forced him to play half of it with me. And so I doubt there's going to be any debate whether or not this game deserves its spot as the second worst game of 2024. Now, before we get to number one, I'd like to hit quite a few dishonorable mentions because there were so many mediocre to bad games I played this year. I'm not really going to go into detail about why each one of these sucked, but but I did want to throw out their names because they deserve to be shit on at least one last time before the year's up. First up, we got the casting of Frank Stone, which is Supermassive's newest game made in the universe of Dead by Daylight. This is one of the worst movie games I've ever fucking played. Holy hell, it was so boring. There's plenty of woke shit as well. It just has pretty much everything bad about all of their releases after Until Dawn. They just haven't been able to write a semi-competent story and compelling characters since then. Then we have Dungeons of Hinterberg, which is just a straight-up DEI, probably government-funded game. Honestly, you could just take one look at the art style and already know that there's no point playing this shit. It's some magical realism puzzle game with brain-dead combat. Next up is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which I already covered in detail in my review. This game is just straight-up mediocre, 5 out of 10, unremarkable. It's not a good adventure game. It's not a good puzzle game. It's not a good shooter, and I feel like the only reason it exists is because Microsoft got the license for the Indiana Jones IP and had to give Machine Games something to do. Next up is Still Wakes the Deep, which is a walking simulator pretending to be a horror game, many such cases, made by the developers of Amnesia Machine for Pigs. And even worse than Machine for Pigs, there's just almost no actual horror in this game. You're just walking from point A to point B, doing a few really basic puzzles. In a lot of cases, they're not even puzzles. And I think there's only 4 or 5 times in the entire game where a monster can kill you. It was just straight up boring trash with an uninteresting story. Next up is Unknown 9 Awakening, featuring the Indian Yennefer from The Witcher show. And this is another just straight up like DEI-funded adventure game that plays like a really shitty Ubisoft game if it was more linear, and just feels like the ultimate like anti-colonialism Indian fantasy where they kill all the white British people. Wowie zowie. And the final dishonorable mention is A Quiet Place: A Road Ahead, which is another stealth horror hide-and-seek game, except you play as a pregnant black woman with asthma in a universe where if you make any noise, you fucking die. And the developers for this game were so lazy that if you sprint at any point where a monster is in the area, it teleports behind you and kills you, even if your back is against the wall. So yeah, the game is dog shit. Okay, finally, let's get to the worst game of 2024. Now, for those of you who watch my streams, this is not the least bit surprising. Dustborn is probably the most woke video game ever made. This is quite literally government-funded propaganda. And the worst part is, the US government helped fund this game despite it being a Norwegian studio. And what is said propaganda, you might be wondering? Well, I almost don't even want to say this phrase out loud because I know there will be a Wikipedia article under the video title, but this game is quite literally about great replacement theory and how it's a good thing. The game spells this out for you in its most iconic song, We're the Dustborn, and famously, they rhyme the term newborn with new porn. Again, I have a warning strike on my channel, so I'm not going to describe what this reminds me of, but let me just say, there's a certain ideology that may or may not be associated with the Illuminati that starts with a Z that pretty much directly describes the things this game is pushing. Even worse, the entire plot of this game surrounds around these magical ghosts, which put misinformation in people's heads. You know, things like maybe an untested vaccine that might alter your RNA, or that the LGBT community might be coming for your kids. You know, that type of misinformation, right? You know, all sorts of right-wing beliefs are all misinformation that the characters correct by removing said ghosts from your head, aka lobotomizing you.
You can't silence all of us. We have a right to speak.
That's true. They do have a right to speak, and we are silencing them. We're literally silencing dissent, but we're the good guys.
Infected with disinformation.
Oh my god.
What the hell? Why did I say those stupid things? I have a medical degree. There's no woke mind virus.
This is supposed to be an alternate future. The word woke wouldn't even exist in this. And the main character's vocal powers are basically just gaslighting. They even describe them as gaslighting in the text, and sometimes even worse. You bully people, and I gotta be careful about how I phrase this because I don't want this to be age restricted, but you tell people to just walk off of a cliff. There is literally a point in the game where you tell enemies to walk off a ledge. They're jumping off the fucking ledge. So canceling people, okay, hold on. They're admitting that canceling people makes them game end, makes them Minecraft themselves. This is unreal, man. Like, if Norwegians had any self-respect, these people would be in prison. Who do you think they're referring to? The worst part of this, too, is like the main gang of characters, this diversity squad, they don't even really like each other. They lie to each other, they manipulate each other. On numerous occasions throughout the story, the main character Pax uses her vocal powers to brainwash her own friends to agree with her or to force them to do things they don't want to do. Her Korean ex-boyfriend, girlfriend, non-binary, whatever, uses their powers to gaslight you. The giant fat Muslim cow is a fucking cop informant. And why did they write that? Oh, because her white spots, her skin condition, is a representation of her inner whiteness. Pax's sister hates her just because she decided to leave the all-female commune that you visit early in the game, and that's a whole bag of worms that I really don't want to get into right now, but the sheer amount of drama between the characters, they clearly don't really like each other on any level. But the main character is so powerful among these discount woke X-Men that she basically becomes their messiah, using the voice to rewrite reality itself. Because when a black woman speaks, you listen. Ironically, one of the biggest issues with this game's story comes down to its very concept, that we're supposed to believe that the power of words are so strong that allows them to defeat the fascists and the chuds and all that. When immediately the thought came to my mind, all it would take the final boss to do is just say the N-word and boom, total party kill right there. It would be absolute Kino. Sadly, this is not that type of game. This game is so fucking blatant with its political propaganda that leftists don't even accept this thing because they know it makes them look bad. Everyone hates this game because it just spells out the truth with no filtering about what progressivism is really about, what cultural Marxism is about, all that shit. You know what woke actually means for the fucking drooling retards who still don't know what it means. This is what woke is. You know, you can look way past the surface level that this is the most diverse cast you've ever seen. I don't have to describe that. Your eyes just watching this footage already knew that. It goes much, much deeper than that, to the point where people thought this was a fucking parody because it's so blatant. But no, it's because the elites are that fucking out of touch. They think they can do whatever the hell they want. And this game is a perfect example of that. And if you think the game bombing means that their ideology failed on any level, you're wrong. Because governments have infinite fucking money. This is truly one of the most sinister games that has ever been made. And because it was so thoroughly mocked, people are going to forget that, but I'm not going to forget that because to me, this is just the ultimate self-report. They know they're bullying people. They know they're canceling people. They think it's okay because they think they're the good guys. They think erasing us is good. If you had to ask me what my biggest regret this year related to the channel is anyway, it was not reviewing this game. You would think forcing myself to suffer through so many bad video games that I'd be prepared for how gay and retarded this is, but I really wasn't, man. I had to play through this over the course of like 5 or 6 weeks because I couldn't stomach playing it for more than 2 hours at a time. And somehow this game is like 15 hours long when it's just walking around and talking. It's a fucking Telltale game, but 15 hours long of suffering. For as funny as it was at points, it ultimately was not worth it. And the final boss, again, you can't even make this shit up. The last enemy of the game is truth. Objective truth is the ultimate enemy of the leftist. It's fucking mind-blowing, man. It's too late to review it now. I know there's gonna be comments that say you should do a video anyway, but nobody cares about this game anymore. I had to say my piece, though. This is probably the closest thing you'll get to a review on it. Just know that this is a worrying sign of things to come. I know people have been swallowing a lot of white pills lately, getting high on that copium because, well, over 10,000 layoffs in the game industry is pretty huge. BlackRock has lost over $1 trillion, yes, $1 trillion investing in ESG programs. But at the end of the day, these people have wormed their way into the game industry. The very developers themselves are far leftists who hate gamers and have told us on many, many occasions that they hate us. And the powers that be, the elites, whatever you personally define that as, think it's perfectly fine to burn money to mock us and to tell us what they want to do to us, because there are no repercussions, okay? Again, I don't want to get banned, so I'm not going to say anything else on this, but this is one of the worst games I've ever played in my life, and is definitely the worst game of 2024. Alright, now that we're finally done with talking about bad games, we can finally cover a few decent ones. Since I never really review good games anymore, this will be a nice change of pace. Now, I'm sure there's going to be some of you who think a few notable games got shafted from this list. But like I said already, you need to view this as a list of recommendations. I purposely omitted a few games because I think you either already played them, or if you didn't, you have no interest in trying them in the first place. So for once, almost every game on here is an indie game. Usually I'm a bit more critical of indies than most other people are, just because I think there's already been so many quality ones released over the past 10 to 15 years. There's no reason to gas up the mid ones just because they're better than AAA releases. But no, shockingly, I actually played 4 really good indie games. So without further ado, let's get into the 5 best games of 2024. Starting off, we have an incredibly simple game that managed to be entertaining from beginning to end, Echo Point Nova. I feel like this is a game that isn't even really worth describing in detail because what you see is what you get. This is a very fast-paced FPS. It's basically a bullet hell where you ride on a surfboard, grind on walls, and try to avoid a dozen enemies shooting you at the same time, and you just kill enemies at high octane speeds over and over and over again. And what makes this game really fun is the movement just feels so good. Your surfboard basically lets you defy gravity. You can just ride straight up walls, jump super high into the air. You have a grapple that lets you swing from any object. And if you're a god at aiming in FPS games, you're definitely gonna love this because you can go as fast as you want and just fucking get trick headshots at Mach speed. Most of the guns are actually pretty fun, despite them being the basic shit you've basically used in every FPS by now. You know, shotguns, SMGs, assault rifles, pistols, etc., etc. But with more realistic projectile speeds, and this is one of the only FPS games I've played in recent memory where the shotguns are actually realistic. So you can actually pretty accurately kill enemies at 50 yards, which feels really fun, man. This is also a little bit like Ratchet & Clank, where as you rack up kills with each gun, they get upgrades, which improve them, which really incentivizes you to use your whole arsenal instead of finding the broken perk combo, namely the one that gives you ammo back as you're grinding on walls, which applies to rockets, by the way. Kind of completely trivializes the game, but still, obviously you want to use all your guns so you can get all the upgrades. On top of this, you also get powers. The default one is just throwing a grenade, but you can also shoot a wind blast that lets you jump high into the air or send enemies into the air. You can freeze the floor to let you surfboard faster. You can use fire to burn straight through walls. And all these mechanics just kind of come together in the perfect way where this game was easily entertaining from start to finish. I could never say I was bored. There's even a bit of a platforming element in this game, and if you know me, you know I love of platformers, and given the really fun physics in this game, even just surfboarding around the huge-ass map was pretty fun in and of itself. Also, the boss fights are actually pretty damn good as well, where you're basically just jumping onto a huge-ass mech, whether it's like a sandworm or a dragonfly, and you shoot all of the weak points, which slowly disintegrates the creature while you're being shot at by like a million auto turrets. It's just cool as hell, man. This is one of those games where I think you can already tell if you're gonna like it just by watching this footage, and I can confirm that it's exactly as fun as it looks. The only reason it's not higher on the list is because you're basically just doing the same thing from start to finish, and the guns certainly could have been a bit more creative. Remember the beginning of Resident Evil 7? I like the beginning. Whoa, holy shit. Run, homie, run! On to number 4, we have another callback to classic survival horror games with Hollow Body. I think those of you who enjoyed Signalis should definitely check this one out. They're somewhat similar in the sense that they're both cyberpunk inspired and obviously have a lot of Silent Hill influence in them. The difference being that this one is a lot more grounded and down to earth, and despite taking place in the future, the main setting of the game is actually in the past because you're in like an abandoned town with 90s technology. But there's a strong psychological horror element to the game, which I don't really want to spoil the moment, but when you're traveling through the sewers, you end up having to collect these hearts to get to the next area of the game, and when you pick up the final one, the game starts to fuck with your head in an incredibly effective way. Generally, it's pretty difficult to scare me when it comes to survival horror games, especially if they're the classic fixed camera tank control style. But I played this part on stream, and you could tell I was visibly starting to get scared. It was shockingly the best instance I've seen of a game like this fucking with the player's head and their mental map of an area. Unfortunately, it was by far the scariest part of the game, and there's nothing else quite like it afterward. And unlike a couple other Resident Evil or Silent Hill likes, the pacing in this is quite good. There's not too many puzzles. There's just enough combat where it doesn't get boring or repetitive. The resource management is handled fairly well. And this definitely has a lot of that melancholy sort of depression atmosphere. There's a character who you talk to at the top of a rooftop, and depending on your choices, I think you can guess what happens to him. That said, even though I'm building up this game to be like the next big survival horror indie classic, it does have quite a few flaws. The first of which being the game is definitely a bit too easy. Another is that a lot of the puzzles aren't really puzzles and more like games of I Spy, where you notice the obvious shit in the environment and combine the obvious things in your inventory, outside of one weirdly cryptic puzzle where you essentially have to use battery acid to melt a lock. That was not very intuitive. Another issue is the town's layout, which is very similar to the Silent Hill games in the sense that in between the dungeons, you're basically just wandering around and meandering until you figure out the next objective. But unlike Silent Hill, this game really does not guide you effectively to the next destination. Now, the map isn't big enough for you to really be wandering around more than 10 minutes at most, but it still felt like you're just wandering aimlessly in a map that has way too many enemies that you can just run past, so they might as well not even be there. And my final two issues with this game are going to sound very familiar to what I said about Signalis, but one, ultimately, this is partially a lesbian love story, not nearly as much as Signalis, where it's the entire story, basically. And my second problem is that the ending sucks, but definitely not for the same reason that Signalis did, to avoid spoiling that game. Ultimately, I do think this is a pretty decent game, and I'm kind of a sucker for this genre. Even though it's definitely coming back into vogue, I've noticed there's a lot more indie survival horror games these days. But unfortunately, this game is without a doubt inferior to Signalis, and it likely is also inferior to Crow Country, which also came out in 2024. And the only reason that isn't here on this list is because I already watched a bunch of gameplay for it, and it isn't the least bit scary to me. And that's kind of a basic requirement for me to enjoy survival horror games. Instead, I decided to play Hollow Body, and I wasn't disappointed. Now, as for number 3, we have a tactics RPG that I can't say I really heard anyone talk about this year, King's Vein. As someone who really likes tactics RPGs that give the player creative freedom to interact with the environment, I end up really liking this game. It reminded me a lot of Divinity Original Sin, where every tile in the game can be affected by the elements, like you can freeze a tile, or set it on fire, or shock it with lightning, to allow you to set up these huge combos to absolutely devastate the enemy army. This is a game where you're very frequently outnumbered, and unlike something like XCOM, the enemy army isn't split into cells that are split up by the fog of war. No, you're fighting the entire squad at the same time. And so if you understand basic action economy, if it's your 5 guys versus 15 of the enemies, if you let those enemies all attack you, you're gonna lose right in the first round. And so this is where the mages come into play. They have these massive AoE attacks that can burn the entire arena, and the enemy AI is not just going to walk through the fire, even if they could survive it. And so you can use this to cut off part of the enemy army from getting to you, buying you an extra turn. And some of the elements will combine together, like you can strike fire with lightning to make it explode if you have the right passive perk. Some arenas will have bottomless pits, and you can straight up push enemies into the pit. This is one of those games where pushing and pulling is really effective, so if you like that sort of thing, it's got that. You can freeze enemies solid, you can cover the arena with spike traps. There's all sorts of different things you have at your disposal, and this game has a really good class system, where if you invest EXP into one class, you unlock another class, and then you put EXP into multiples to unlock a more advanced class. But if you decide to dedicate yourself to one class, you can use all that extra EXP to upgrade the individual skills. This is one of those games where it uses a lot of small numbers, and so when you can cast a spell one more tile over, or you make your spell do 1 or 2 more damage, that makes a massive difference in whether you win or lose. Another kind of unique element to this game I haven't really seen before is you can use all of your combat abilities outside of combat, sort of turning this into a immersive sim, where any of your spells that would have utility in a combat arena also work in the overworld. So let's say there's a building with a locked door that you have no key to. Well, you can use fire to burn down the walls if it's made of plant matter. Or you can use electricity to activate a special electric tile to open the door. Or you can even use a whip to pull a switch inside to open it. And one of the late game classes allows you to teleport wherever you can throw an object, and you can use this to basically like jump around the map and basically skip certain puzzles or do things out of order. And so I thought that's a really cool element. And I don't want to go into too much detail about all the combat stuff, but I really liked a lot of the different synergies that classes had. I made my character into a dude who could summon flies and then shoot said flies with his crossbow, which did absolutely massive single target damage, especially when teamed up with one of my other character classes who was more like a tank. He could set down a tile that boosts the attack of anyone who stands on it by 3, which is huge in this game. And so the fly dude was doing like 20 damage in a shot, which is like crazy. And the enemy variety is pretty damn good as well, where the main enemy of this game is like these little ghost dudes who can inhabit bodies. And so whenever you kill a wisp enemy, it spawns a little node, and the nodes can resurrect enemies. But they do it on a delay. They have all sorts of delayed attacks, which are essentially the balance mechanism for AoE moves, because most of the best magic spells only activate after your opponent's turn. And so the enemy AI is smart enough to move out of the way of the AoE, but you can set up scenarios where they can't get out of it by reducing their movement with one of your other characters. And a lot of the AI enemies will copy your character classes and be able to do the exact same stuff you do, which just makes for like a really compelling and surprisingly deep combat system where every single turn matters, you know, like XCOM or basically any good tactics game, I would say. This is definitely one of those games where I had a lot of fun with it. Once I started it, I basically just played it from start to finish over the course of 4 or 5 days. I was absolutely hooked. But I'll admit, it's definitely not a game for everyone. Some people just don't like tactics RPGs. Some people might not like the limited Super Nintendo looking aesthetic. And in a way, you could say the game's almost a little bit too balanced, where even though there are a few semi-broken combos, the mage classes were kept almost a little bit too in check by the fact that you had so few ways to effectively limit your opponent's movement, so they can just run out of the way of your giant AoE explosions, and then it feels like you kind of wasted your turn. But this is definitely a fun game, and I would recommend it to anybody who likes this genre. This whole game is like, remember when PlayStation was good? Stop. You're gonna make me sad. How the fuck did this get made? Is there like one guy at Sony like, I'm making a good game? Fuck this gay movie game shit. I'm making a good game. And you can't stop me. Oh yeah, you knew Astrobot had to be on here. Anybody who's been watching this channel long enough knows I love 3D platformers, and I've been waiting for them to make a big return for something like 7 or 8 years at this point. And this was finally the year of the 3D platformer. Astrobot has to be the best PlayStation exclusive since, I hate to say it, but probably Bloodborne. This basically feels like Super Mario Galaxy, but made by PlayStation with an absolute metric ton of references to their classic exclusive franchises, and even more third-party games that used to be exclusives. Basically, if you grew up with a PlayStation 1, 2, or 3, all of your favorite characters are going to be in this game. Even characters that were weirdly snubbed out of the original release just got added in the Christmas level, that being Gex, Croc, and Rayman, so they basically got everybody. Now again, the cynical way to look at it is that this is basically a graveyard of all of the great PlayStation franchises that are never coming back, but all of the member berries definitely brought a smile to my face. Now as a game, ironically, this is where Astrobot sort of falters a little bit. If you compare the basic mechanics of this to any Mario game, this is way too simplistic and requires almost no skill. I've heard the defense for this being that this is supposed to essentially be a baby game, which people condescendingly called the entire genre of 3D platformers. I don't care. I love these baby games. But the thing is, Super Mario 64 was a lot of people's first 3D platformer, and the movement was a lot more complex and had a much higher skill ceiling than Astrobot's. You just had way more moves. Astro can only waddle around, spin, do a hover jump, and in most levels you get some kind of power-up, which definitely varies up the gameplay. And I think most of the power-ups are pretty cool. I love punching dudes. I love the sponge mode. That reminded me a lot of Super Mario Sunshine, which is my favorite 3D Mario. The dog jetpack was definitely fun because this game desperately needed a run button. You were just way too slow. It's weird that that's my biggest complaint with this game, and you'll see that, well, this might be a mild spoiler if you know what's coming already, but my personal game of year certainly didn't have this problem. But yeah, the fact that you're just moving at like a jogging speed, and even though these are mostly linear levels, I'd still say you move definitely a little bit too slow for how large they are. Another problem, weirdly enough, with this game, but only in certain levels, is the camera. In all of the challenge levels, it has this weird isometric perspective, and even if you move the camera, it moves back by itself. And when the background of these levels is endless space, the depth perception is off, which really makes the levels harder than they needed to be. And a lot of the challenge kind of feels artificial as well, because Astro dies in one hit to basically everything. So that was kind of annoying. I mean, on the one hand, I do welcome the challenge when most of the game is so brain dead easy, but on the other, it wasn't exactly a fair challenge. But I'd say like the actual level design of this game is really solid. Yes, a lot of the level themes are things you've already seen a bunch of times already, like the spooky level, the forest level, the Japanese level, the industrial level, etc., etc. I still think they were fairly well designed. They're pretty appealing. The exploration element of the game was handled fairly well. I always wanted to try and find as many of the bots as possible, especially for the member berries. And I think this is just the type of game that it almost feels like uncovering forgotten nostalgia from your childhood, where it absolutely could have slotted in as one of my favorite games when I was a kid. This was a game that was clearly made for the fans, for gamers. But yeah, even though this game probably doesn't stand up to my favorites from my childhood, like Super Mario 64, Sunshine, Galaxy, Spyro 1 and 2, Banjo-Kazooie, Still, I really enjoyed 100%ing this game, which I feel like I never go out of my way to do everything in any game that comes out anymore because it's never worth the time and it's almost never fun. But in this game, I just enjoyed collecting things, as you should in this genre. So if for some reason you bought a PS5, you absolutely need to play this game. Now to quickly go over the honorable mentions, again, I'm not going to elaborate too much on these because this video is already going to be insanely long as it is, but this is where all of the games that you likely think are shafted from the top 5 ended up, because I don't think I need to recommend games to you that I either 1, already reviewed and said were good, or 2, you most likely already played. So starting off, we have Black Myth Wukong, which is shockingly good for being a Chinese AAA game. Just saying that out loud, you think it's going to be ass, but it turned out to be actually a pretty damn good Souls-like that distinguished itself enough from the likes of Dark Souls and that whole genre to basically be its own thing. Then next up is Stellar Blade, which is in a very similar situation. Instead of being made by the Chinese, it's made by Koreans, and while I don't think it's quite as good as Black Myth Wukong, to make up for that, it has a sexy protagonist, so to some, you might actually prefer this game to Black Myth Wukong for that reason alone, but it's definitely worth trying if you have a PS5. Then we have Shadow Generations, which is probably the only game that I purposely removed from the top 5 just because I didn't want to have 3 3D platformers on there for variety's sake, but in my opinion, this is the 3rd best Sonic game of all time. It is better than Sonic Generations in every conceivable way, and it shows that Sonic Team might actually know what they're doing for once, and gives me just a little bit of hope for the future of Sonic for the first time in like 20 years. I don't think I need to say this, but if you're a Sonic fan, you absolutely have to play this. Then we have Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. This is a great co-op horde shooter to play with your friends. If you're playing by yourself, obviously not so much, but I still enjoyed my time with this game, and I'd probably recommend it to anybody who likes this sort of thing. And for the final honorable mention, I can't believe I'm even putting this on the good list, Dragon's Dogma 2. If this was a list of the most disappointing games this year, this would be number 1, but I have to admit it is also one of the best games I played this year, because even though it is inferior to the first game in almost every single way, it is still just a really solid action RPG. Yes, it's flawed in all of the ways that I covered in my video, but it is just really fun to play. It's fun to climb giant monsters and stab them in the face. The character creator is still one of the best in gaming, even if it was slightly nerfed in certain ways. But it's just so goofy, it brings a smile to my face, and it just has some of that Japanese soul, even though it's got less than the first game in certain ways. I'd still recommend the first one over this one in basically every scenario, but yeah, by 2024 standards, it's one of the best games of the year. And now for my Game of the Year 2024. This is a game that if you don't watch my streams, you probably have no idea what this is. Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom. I'm sure even hearing such a fucking Reddit-ass title makes you not want to try this, but I promise you, if you like 3D platformers, it is worth it. The title pretty much spells it out. You play as a taxi, and you drive around these 3D platformer levels while boosting off of ramps to cross impossible distances and collect all of the gears to save the world from the corrupted oil that Alien Musk, no affiliation with Elon Musk, is creating to destroy the world or something. The story obviously does not matter here. This is another game where you just watch this footage and everything you're seeing right here is exactly what you get. The reason why this game is number 1 is because it has some of the best 3D platformer controls I have ever experienced in my life. The very simple way to describe it is to just say it's like Super Mario 64, but if you were driving a car instead of running around as Mario. And for some reason, that is just like the perfect formula for fun platforming that I would have never thought of in 1,000 years. Obviously, there is quite a bit of a learning curve if you've played games in this genre and you're obviously not used to driving around a car, because it really just does control exactly how you would expect a car to control in a 3D platformer. But once you get the hang of it, it just feels so great, dude. And this game has a super boost where you hit the acceleration after you started boosting, and it gives you a double boost, which sends you even further into the air. You can boost in midair to get even further horizontal distance. There's no dedicated jump button in this game. The way you jump is you actually cancel a dash and you start flipping, but you can also do this while reversing to do a back jump. And you can also double jump in midair, and there's a timer on boosting in midair, so if you get enough air time, you can boost or flip again. And all of these moves together just create like such a tight, fun platforming experience. And the level design is another thing that's like, it's creative, it's fun, it's shamelessly Italian. There's a level that's literally just all pizza, there's pizza people, and it's all about eating the pizza people, and there's a lot of stupid, goofy, kind of Reddit humor-esque jokes, but not to the point of being mega cringe. It's just kind of like charming, goofy, harmless humor. This game is just incredibly charming, and another thing it's got going for it is it actually has a shocking amount of content. I remember back when A Hat in Time came out and it only had 4 levels, it really left me wanting more, even if they were huge levels and there were a lot of timepieces to collect. Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom has like over 15 levels and 250 gears to collect. This has more content than a lot of modern AAA releases and was basically made by 2 guys. This is truly an impressive feat, and almost nobody has talked about this game. I certainly haven't seen any YouTube videos about it. My brother only knows one guy who's talked about it. And yes, at the end of the day, I feel like that has to do with the worst title I have ever seen a video game have ever. I just have to say it again. Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom. I mean, really? But this is a game that I am 100% okay with shilling, because this is exactly what a 3D platformer should be. It controls great, has awesome level design, has some cool power-ups, and it has a unique gimmick that makes it stand out from the rest of the genre. While Astrobot is basically a bunch of glorified member berries in a game that is worse than Super Mario Galaxy in basically every way, Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom is a completely new experience while being familiar enough to hit you right in the childhood. This is the best 3D platformer that I've ever recommended on this channel. I can promise you that. I know I've recommended a couple not as good ones in the past, like Hell Pie, but I swear to you, this game is awesome. Just give it a fucking chance, dude. It's so good. Well, there you have it. There's my best and worst games of 2024. Man, this year sucked ass. I feel like I say that every year, but this has got to be one of the worst in gaming history. If it wasn't for those indie games, it without a doubt would be. It's probably the worst year for AAA games of all time, where I don't even know if I really would consider Astrobot AAA, but if I would, it's like the only game that really stood out to me. Everything else, even stuff like Black Myth Wukong, Stellar Blade, Space Marine 2, they just feel like games I've already played before a bunch of times, even if they were pretty good. But all of the biggest game releases of this year end up being garbage, whether it's Suicide Squad or Concord, Dragon Age Veilguard, the list goes on. Pretty much everything sucked. There was a bunch of D-makes as well. This is probably the most woke year in gaming history, even though I'm sure some people are tired of hearing that word by now. It's just the simplest way to describe games full of DEI, ESG, left-wing propaganda, neo-Marxism, etc., etc., etc. Those words have more syllables than woke. And though I have gone on record to say multiple times in the past that indie is no replacement for AAA, there were a few indie games this year that sort of scratched the same itch that I was missing from the good old days. So yeah, ultimately, it was another terrible year in gaming, but at least I spent the last few weeks of the year playing mostly good stuff, so it's not all bad, I guess. Hopefully 2025 is significantly less shitty, and if it's not, I sincerely hope there is a video game crash. Either one would make me happy at this point. That's about it. See you next time, guys.